Hi, everybody. It's nice to be with you all tonight. My name is Meredith Melendez, and I am the county agricultural agent for Mercer County. And I am talking to you tonight about food safety. I spend most of my time talking about produce safety. I work directly with produce growers statewide to help them with compliance with federal regulations and buyer requirements. But I recognize that we probably don't have all produce growers here in this group. So I wanted to talk more broadly about food safety considerations for farms in New Jersey. And it's been just increasing in terms of the amount of regulations that impact our farms when it comes to a lot of different things, but more so with food safety, with increased regulations that are impacting farms, regardless of what it is that they're producing. So to start, this slide does focus on produce, and it's a good example of why we do spend so much time talking about human health hazards and produce, particularly produce that's consumed raw. Anytime we have any food product that doesn't go through a cooking process, otherwise known as a kill step, any type of contaminant that could have been on the surface that would be normally killed by a high heat process wouldn't be killed if someone's consuming it raw. And so I think everyone here is probably very well aware of the number of outbreaks in the past few years that have occurred specifically with romaine lettuce. It always seems to hit around a holiday or where there's high demand for romaine, and that's devastating for the farms that are growing romaine, because usually when there's an outbreak, it's in a very focused small area of production where the contamination is occurring, but it has an impact on the entire market, no matter where that romaine came from. And so we have had times where there have been outbreaks of certain commodities that we've had, in active harvest here in New Jersey. Typically, those outbreaks have happened in California or Arizona, and it doesn't matter that it's local produce that we have on our shelves here. Consumers just don't want to buy anything that's associated with an outbreak, even if it has nothing to do with the outbreak. So this chart shows you outbreaks that have been linked to produce, and this is for the time period of 1996 and 2014. And you could see the biggest issues here have been with leafy greens and sprouts. When we think about how leafy greens grow, they grow close to the ground. Often when you're irrigating leafy greens, that water is coming in contact with the greens. A lot of times leafy greens are harvested in bulk, washed in bulk, and then packed in bulk. And so there's a lot of potential in that process for contamination if preventative practices aren't implemented. And even if a lot of preventative practices are put into place, no matter what we're producing, you can never really eliminate the risk, right? These human pathogens are in the environment, and and so the best that we can do is try to prevent contamination in the first place. Sprouts is pretty high because oftentimes sprouts growers will purchase seed that looks visibly fine, maybe has some assurances about its safety, but seeds can become contaminated on the surface. And sprouts grow in a warm, moist growing environment. And so that's the perfect environment to grow a pathogen. So you've got a pathogen on the surface of something, and then you're providing it with everything that it needs to grow and survive. And that's why we see a number of outbreaks associated with sprouts. So when we focus on the microorganisms of concern in here in the Mid-Atlantic region on our farms, we really focus in on the bacteria. We spend a lot of time talking to farmers about Salmonella, pathogenic E. coli, and more lately, we've been talking about Listeria monocytogenes. And that was the microorganism that was implicated in the outbreak with the cantaloupes from Colorado a number of years ago, where 73 people died. And the trouble with Listeria is it'll grow in a refrigerated environment. Whereas the Salmonella and the E. coli and others, their growth is really slowed at those cooler temperatures. But Listeria is something that can really be difficult to eradicate from our packing houses in environments that are typically maybe more wet than others. And the fact that it'll grow in the cooler, it'll grow in someone's refrigerator makes it really problematic. So when we think about viruses, we think more about prepared foods where we've got people handling the food and distributing the food to others. More cooked foods viruses can survive on. We think about cafeterias, and more institutional settings is where we talk more about viruses. Parasites, we don't spend a lot of time talking about here, particularly with produce, because that's something that tends to be an issue in warmer climates and with water. Although not to say that it isn't slowly creeping north as the temperatures are changing also. So bacteria, we'll focus on bacteria, and bacteria is problematic in farm environments because it can grow and survive both inside a host, being humans and animals, but it can also grow and survive on surfaces outside of a host. So just because it's not inside of someone doesn't mean that it doesn't have the potential to continue to grow. And as long as it has the right environment and it has food, right? So warmer temperatures, it has moisture and a food source. So any organic matter that's out there. So anything that is living or was living could be a food source for these bacteria, right? Then you've got that kind of perfect storm. You've got everything that bacteria needs to survive and grow. And when it's surviving and growing, then it's a potential for contamination with food products. So we focus on good agricultural practices. It's all about prevention practices to reduce the risk of that cross-contamination. So this slide just gives you an example of if you had those right conditions that I just talked about, how you could go from dew to bacterium, if there's a food source, if it's the right temperature, if there's moisture, and in 8 hours, you could have an incredible amount of bacterium that right? That's enough to make somebody sick. Now, depending on the pathogen, some pathogens, we would have to consume a lot of that pathogen in order to become sick, where others, there's a lower dose. So there's a lot of variation depending on which pathogens we're talking about. And because we can't see these, you can't see it in the farm environment. We can only talk about practices that could lead to cross-contamination. Then that's why we really focus on that prevention. So as I said earlier, right, we focus a lot on prevention of human pathogens in produce because many produce items are typically consumed raw. It's important to note too that with any food, once that food becomes contaminated, it's virtually impossible to fully get rid of the contaminant, right? And in some cases, you can kill it with a heat step, but not everything that we produce on our farms is going to be cooked. And so we want to make sure that we're just preventing cross-contamination to begin with. And so you can see the surfaces of some of these produce items here, right? From a distance, something might look a little bit more smooth than if we got up close and personal with it, right? You can see how there's lots of space on the strawberry, on the cantaloupe, and on the lettuce leaves there for a pathogen to just sort of hunker down and become really difficult to remove. And so you might be thinking, well, I see lots of produce washes available at the grocery store, and why I could just wash it. And the research has just shown that all of those produce wash items that you see in the store, they're just as effective at cleaning the surface of a produce item as running water. And so it might give you peace of mind and make you feel better that you're doing something. But washing produce before consuming is our general recommendation under clean water. So in the farm environment, we focus on what could possibly be the source of contamination for these food items. Right? We focus a lot on humans. Humans are really great at showing up to work when they're sick, be actively shedding some of these pathogens without realizing it. Maybe they don't have symptoms yet. and being a source of cross-contamination by not following through with proper hand washing and proper restroom use. We also know that these pathogens are just naturally endemic in the soil, right? If we sampled soil, we would find E. coli, right? It's an outside environment. We're never going to be able to sanitize a farm. And so we just have to assume that these things are out there. Water is also another contamination source. We focus a lot on buildings, so appropriate buildings to be using, so maintaining them in an appropriate way. Any equipment that's used for that's going out into the field, or that any of these food items are coming in contact with, as well as any tools that might be used, particularly during harvest of crops. And then certainly animals. We're never going to be able to fully eliminate animals from the field as well. So as I said, right, humans can really be great at cross-contamination. And so in any type of farm environment where we are producing food for humans or for animals, right, the people that work in that environment need to be aware of the risks that are involved, the health hazards that are involved for themselves, as well as the ultimate end consumer of the products that are being produced. So making sure that training is appropriate for the workers based on what crops are being grown, making sure that there's appropriate restrooms and hand washing facilities for the workers, because it really starts there, right? With the ability to use a proper restroom and the ability by having supplies to wash hands, and that they understand when hand washing needs to take place and what is appropriate hand washing. I think now, after, that we've been through this pandemic, everybody should know. I don't think there's an excuse now to not know how to properly wash hands. Workers also need to understand when they themselves are a contamination source because of illness or because of an injury. And so a farm should have proper steps to first take care of that worker, but then to make sure that they didn't contaminate anything in the process. So farms also need to be aware of the animals that are coming onto the property that they don't have control over, as well as the animals like livestock and other pets that could be on the farm, right? All of these animals are consuming food on the farm, they're defecating on the farm, and they're having an impact on potential contamination risks in the farm as they are moving through the crops, and then through other areas where humans are. We focus on water because water can absorb lots of things from the environment, and it can absorb and carry and cross-contaminate a variety of surfaces and areas on a farm, just because it could have E. coli in it. Typically, we do irrigation water sampling where we look for generic E. coli, and that gives us an overall indication of the safety of the water. But we think about all the ways that water is used on farms, right? We use it for irrigation, we use it for frost protection, for any pesticide applications that happen at the farm. We use it for hand washing, we use it for washing crops that we're growing, we use it to cool. And we use it to clean, right? We're cleaning all of these surfaces with water. And so if that water isn't of sanitary quality, right? And so we're looking for a non-detectable generic E. coli test for water that's used in everything there except for irrigation and crop sprays. We follow the surface water standard for recreation water with that. It's really important that water is of good quality. And so when we do lots of farm visits, we come across plenty of farms that have never tested the water on the farm. And so we generally recommend for a well that that well is tested once a year for that generic E. coli. And for any surface water, so in the picture you see a pond there, we're looking for 3 times during the production season to test that for generic E. coli. So just having an idea of that quality of water over time is important. We also focus on soil amendments, particularly composting and use of animal manures, right? The animal manure can be a source of some of these pathogens. And so the general standard that's acceptable by the federal regulation is the National Organic Program standards, right? So there's a certain amount of time and temperature requirements and turning requirements for that compost to ensure that those pathogen levels are brought down low enough. And so when we have raw manures on farms, we think about not just the manures themselves, but what equipment's being used to transport the manures around the farm. Is there potential for people's feet, right? We've got tread on our shoes that can be a source of cross-contamination, as well as surfaces of equipment and tires and things. So it's really nice when we get to go out and do a farm visit and really see the farm in action to be able to assess the individual risks and have these conversations in place. This contamination of surfaces is an area that we spend a lot of time working with farms across the state because the cleaning and sanitation of these food contact surfaces is critical, and can be a pain in the neck. It's time consuming, and it means supplies. It means training somebody to do it, and so. It's not the most fun thing to do, but it is foundational to preventing human pathogen risks in the farm environment, particularly when we have typically consumed raw foods coming in contact with those surfaces. And so what we like to see is that a farm at the beginning of the season knows what their food contact surfaces are, right? So they're able to prioritize certain surfaces in terms of which ones are going to be cleaned and sanitized more frequently than others. We like to see a deep clean at the beginning of the season because these surfaces can get quite dirty during the winter months when they're not in use. And then we like to see an action plan in place, right? So the farm knows exactly what detergents they're using, what sanitizers they're using. They understand the label instructions on these things, and that they've got staff that's trained in order to be able to follow through with cleaning and sanitation the surfaces. So when we see that the surfaces aren't being cleaned and sanitized appropriately, what happens is a biofilm can form on those surfaces. And I think the most visual way to think of a biofilm is the gunk that forms in a shower drain, right? So it's moist there, that you've got organic matter down in there, and then the bacteria that's there, it's got the perfect environment to be able to grow and get really gunky. Well, those biofilms can form on these surfaces also in a packing house and other areas. And so without regular scrubbing with a detergent and follow through with the sanitizer, right, we're not really getting those surfaces clean enough to prevent the potential for harborage of these human pathogens. And so we feel like we've seen a nice increase in the amount of cleaning and sanitation that's happening on farms across the state due to just a lot of talking about it. So when we think about a farm and the process in terms of ensuring food safety, right, we want farms to start off with assessing their produce safety or their food safety risks. And so every farm's risks are going to be different than another farm's, right? Every farm does things differently, has different equipment, growing different things, has different levels of tolerance for what's risky and what's not. And so an assessment of that farm allows the farm to be able to say, okay, these are my risks. Because of these risks and how I feel about them, I'm going to implement certain practices that I feel reduce those risks. These are those preventative practices. Farms get to decide how they want to monitor, how they're going to keep track to make sure that those practices are actually being implemented and followed through by workers, and that they continue to be appropriate for reducing risk on the farm. Farms also need to have the ability to recognize when something's going wrong and implement corrective actions so that way they can course correct and get back on track in terms of reducing risk in a way that's appropriate. And then a farm needs to decide which records are they going to keep in order to prove that they did what they've said they've done. And so a regulator will always say, if you didn't keep a record, it didn't happen. It doesn't matter if you say it happened, it didn't happen if they didn't have a record for it. And so we're seeing an increasing amount of records that farms are expected to keep across the board with with food safety being one that falls on top. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about food safety regulations that impact New Jersey farms, and that I would start at the local level first. So the local municipality or township, right, they're going to have regulations that impact retail and commercial zoning. So what type of retail operations can happen on a farm property? And so conversations need to be had locally first, right? Ideally before an incredible amount of time is spent making a plan, and certainly before money is spent on implementing a plan. The local health departments will have food sales location regulations, so it's good to know what those are before you head down that road of producing food. If you are thinking about selling at a farmer's market, it's usually the local health department inspector that'll show up and do food safety inspections at the farmer's market. And then they're, depending on the municipality, there could be local health and safety certifications that are required based on what it is that you're doing. Typically, if it's a farm that's just producing raw farm products, that there's no processing going on, it's pretty limited as to the amount of inspection and oversight that the local municipality will have. It's really when you start taking raw materials and creating something else that begins to trigger more certification and inspection requirements. When it comes to the state, our state food code currently is called Chapter 24. The state is in the process of accepting the federal food code. And so there'll be some changes to our state food code once the federal food code is adopted. And we work closely with Don Schaffner, who's an extension specialist with food safety here at Rutgers, who keeps me up to date when it comes to processing and regulations. The state also regulates agricultural commodity brokers and dealers, so people who are buying in product and then turning around and selling it to others. There is a licensing fee and an application that's required in order to be an ag commodity broker in the state. The state also, the Department of Health also has these minimum guidelines that you see here for product sales at farmers markets and community farmers markets. And so this is a nice, just easy sort of cheat sheet on the bare minimum of what the requirements are if you wanted to sell certain items at a farmer's market. This is being updated because of the newly adopted cottage food law, which I'll talk about next. And then the Department of Health in the state gets involved when we've got processed food that's being made and sold in the state. So not sure how familiar everyone is with the cottage food law. A lot of people, especially home bakers, were really excited when this finally went through. We were the last state in the nation to get a cottage food law. So here in New Jersey, you are now allowed to create some value-added products in your home kitchen, provided that your sales are under $50,000, that you're in compliance with the best practices that the state has defined, that you also have conducted a water test report, and that you are in compliance with all your local municipal requirements. So that's where it get tricky with zoning and other requirements that your municipality might have. It costs $100 for a 2-year registration. And the cottage food law is, it has specific items that you're allowed to produce in your kitchen for retail or for sales. So it's any baked goods that do not require refrigeration. So cheesecakes are out, right? They need to be refrigerated so they don't fall under the cottage food law. You can do fruit jams, jellies, and preserved. Any fruit pies that don't need to be refrigerated, dried fruit, herbs, seasonings, baking mixes, granola, trail mix, popcorn, nuts, dried tea. The dried tea one is one that I know a lot of farms had interest in doing and were sort of prevented a little bit by doing that. And now the cottage food law makes it interesting that a farm operation could be able to do something in their kitchen. And then it also includes vinegar and mustard. Originally, it included honey, and that was finally taken out because honey just didn't belong in there. Our Department of Agriculture, they're involved with commodity inspections, so that's produce inspections. They'll go to farmers markets, retail stands, and purchase produce, and then do testing on the produce to make sure that there aren't any pesticides that are off-label use on the products. They also do shipping point and terminal market inspections. They conduct USDA third-party produce audits, and those audits are required by some buyers. So examples of buyers that require these annual audits would be ShopRite, Wegmans, Walmart's, right? They are requiring a food safety inspection annually that the farm pays for in order to purchase produce from those farms. They also conduct the FSMA produce safety rule inspections. They are credentialed by the FDA to do that. And then they conduct dairy inspections in the state. So just a quick note about the Food Safety Modernization Act. This is an FDA regulation that was signed into law back in 2011. And it's they only started doing inspections on farms for produce back in 2018. So it's taken a long time to get some of these rules that are part of FSMA implemented. And thankfully, the FDA, specifically to farms, has really tried to have an educate before and while you regulate attitude, which has been helpful, because the idea of the FDA coming onto farms to do these inspections was a little bit scary for a lot of people. But you can see, right, it's more than produce. There's preventive controls for human food. So that covers any processing that takes place. And so to give an example of the difference between a farm that would be covered by the produce safety rule versus a farm that would be covered by the preventive controls rule. So if you have a farm that's growing broccoli and they're harvesting broccoli in the field like normal broccoli would be harvested, and then that's getting packaged or put into boxes and then sold to an end user or sold to a grocery store, a restaurant, or a wholesaler, that would fall under the produce safety rule. If that farm were to take all of that broccoli and bring it in and chop it up into small florets and then package it up, that would fall under that preventive controls rule, because processing is considered beyond your normal harvesting and cleaning of produce. And so the preventive controls rule is a little bit more complicated than the produce safety rule, but we're finding, right, we've got a great market here in New Jersey for value-added products, and farms are capitalizing on that. And so we're finding we're talking more and more to farms about the preventive controls rule and what compliance looks like for them. There's also a preventive controls rule for animal food. There's a food traceability rule. So this goes back to all of those outbreaks and the federal government wanting to be able to trace food that may have made people sick all the way back to its origin, right? You have to have lot codes and information that can connect that product all the way back to its origin. And so the food traceability rule is going to go into effect in 3 years. And there are certain produce items that are covered by that. And it certainly covers all food items that are sold. And so this is going to be interesting. We don't have all the full details yet, and it's probably going to be messy in terms of trying to make this make sense for farms. But that's what we're here for. So that's something I'm going to be learning a lot more about. All the way at the bottom here, you see there's a FDA food facility registration. And so any farm that goes into processing, right? So first verify if this is a road you head down with your farm dream. If you think you might be heading into processing, reach out to me and have a conversation with me, because we don't want to trigger any regulations for you that maybe don't really apply. We don't want anyone making any assumptions about where they fall when it comes to processing, because if you are doing processing, then you would be required to register as a food facility, and that's an annual inspection by the FDA, right? So we talked about the produce safety rule. That is the FDA, but the state will show up for that, and that's friendlier, right? They're on their home turf. It's a little bit easier to have an inspection. from our Department of Agriculture. But when it comes to the FDA showing up, it is a little bit different. So I would encourage anyone who has any questions or thoughts, right? You're thinking to the future or planning or trying to make some decisions, feel free to reach out and ask questions. If it's something I don't know, I know the people that that would be able to give you the nitty gritty on what would you actually have to comply with. So I'd much rather you ask than find out when it's too late. So just to wrap this all up, I know it was kind of like drinking out of a fire hose. It's a lot. Food safety really does help a farm in a bunch of different ways. So if you've got a food safety plan based on what it is that you're producing, maybe you've got some policies in place, you're implementing some preventive practices to keep food safe, you're keeping some records. If anything ever were to happen, in terms of somebody accusing you of making them sick, or if there ever was an outbreak, right? You've got stuff to back up that you were doing the best that you could. And so it really can help in terms of liability in the long run. If you've got if you're implementing food safety on the farm, you can talk about food safety and what it is that you're producing, right? That's going to only increase your buyer confidence, whether it's at the farmer's market and you're talking to the person who's going to consume it, or if you're talking to someone that you're trying to pitch your products to. Food safety is always going to be an important part of the conversation when you're trying to sell whatever it is that you're producing. Being prepared for audits, being prepared for jumping through hoops when it comes to food safety can only increase your market access. We are seeing more and more requirements for compliance with audits and inspections, other expectations by buyers for food safety purposes. All of these preventive practices and these reducing risk practices that I talked about tonight, that also, not only does it help reduce human pathogens, right, but it also helps reduce the amount of bacteria that's on the product in general, and that is going to increase your shelf life and the overall quality of the product. We have found produce growers in particular that through using sanitizers and improving their practices, that they have increased the shelf life of their product. And then, yeah, like I said, just being able to communicate about what you're doing to keep your product safe is really important in terms of gaining confidence from your buyers, and can be really important overall in terms of the bottom line for your operation. So Melissa, I was like in a time warp. I have no idea how I did on time. I've got my email address here, and please feel free to reach out if there's anything specific to your plans that you want to talk about. I'm more than happy to do that. And I don't know if we have any time for questions.
We do, Meredith. You're fine on time. In fact, we've got several minutes here that we can go through some of these questions. So if we scroll up through the chat, the first question for you, Meredith: what's the difference between coliform and E. coli?
Right. So when we think about total coliforms, we try to explain this as like that there was a really big circle, and the total coliforms would be that big circle. E. coli is a narrower subset that would fall within that circle, right? So total coliforms can give you an idea of quality of water, but E. coli is going to narrow it down a little bit further and give us a better idea of the overall quality of that water, right? And there are lots of different types of E. coli also, right? There's E. coli that are perfectly fine for us to have in our gut, and then we're really focused on the pathogenic E. coli.
Thank you.
Yep.
Catherine asks, are there special food safety rules for pick your own?
Right. So when it comes to pick your own, right, because your buyers are coming to the farm and handling the product and not asking you to comply with food safety requirements, right? There aren't specific requirements that a buyer would have for you in that regard. But if it's a farm that is selling more than $500,000 of produce or of food, on an average year, then that farm, that pick your own farm, would have to comply with the federal produce safety rule. And so then we go back into all those preventive practices and some record keeping requirements that the federal government would have for that farm. And that would include it's probably once every 3 years in inspection of the farm. And so for those farms, it's really hard. Those types of farms are used to talking with customers on the farm, consumers on the farm, about lots of things, usually not about produce safety. And then the idea of having an inspector come on the farm and having lots of food safety questions for them can be difficult. So there is a process called the on-farm readiness review for farms. It's free and it's confidential. The farm has to request it. And it's where somebody from the state, one of the state inspectors, goes out to the farm with an extension educator and talks about produce safety with that farm in relation to the rule, and really helps them understand what an inspection would look like on that farm and prepare them for that inspection in a more comfortable setting. And so that goes back to that educate before and while you regulate idea that the FDA had, which is kind of mind-blowing, because when does the federal government ever do that? So it's nice to have that process, especially for farms where this idea of produce safety is a new concept.
Thank you. And Maria would like to know, are there any recommendations for digital record keeping in relation to all these rules that you just discussed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So someone I work with at the University of Vermont looked into, I think it was 6 or 7 different apps and programs that are out there now that are marketing themselves to farms as a digital record keeping option. And what they found at the University of Vermont was that not one of them really sort of ticked all the boxes as for what a farm would need in terms of thinking about the big picture of record keeping on a farm, right? Not just food safety. And so the consensus is using Google Docs and creating your own documents that make sense for you was the best way at this point for some digital record keeping, because it allows you to share it with other people who might be involved with the record keeping, be able to, if you've got someone at the farm who needs to see something at a particular time, it's pretty easy to come up with it. But the time up front to really create all of the templates that you need is the hard part of that. But that was their consensus. Although I'm sure there will be many more options coming out in the future.
Hey, Meredith, if I could just comment on that. I mean, the challenge that we've found with something as like Google Docs is that it still remains editable. And so I'm seeking a solution that would enable the person who takes the record to enter the information regarding the production or process that they did, and then sign it and then lock editing. So there's no longer a way for someone to change what has been entered. And the only other thought that I have is a PDF that you would sign, and then typically when you sign, it's locked for editing, but that's still really bulky.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm trying to think, if you just Google University of Vermont, Ag Engineering was the group that did it, and digital record keeping, you should be able to find it. And then you could take a look at the programs that they took a look at, and there might be something that just seems maybe more agreeable to you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And we have one more question on cottage food definitions. What do you know about pepper jelly?
I don't know anything about pepper jelly. I would say take a look at the application for the cottage food rule. They do have a process where I think you can submit recipes if you have a question about something specific that you want. If it doesn't cover pepper jelly in there, then you should be able to talk to somebody at the Department of Health that could give you guidance.
Thank you. And I have a question for you before we launch your poll questions.
Okay.
Many of the producers joining us today are beginning farmers and are looking at their first year of production, and they're still trying to hone in on what they should focus on. In terms of the food safety range, can you give them some example of produce that has the least issues versus some commodities that have the most issues.
Okay, so the closer something grows to the ground, that we would consider typically consumed raw, the greater the issues, right? When we think about that chart that in the beginning with the leafy greens in particular, and then other commodities that are growing directly on the ground.
Thank you for writing path.
And so, we think about staked tomatoes, they're up off of the ground because they're staked, right? That the less issue there. And then certainly anything that would be cooked normally, right? So sweet corn would be less risky than something that's typically consumed raw. But yeah, the FDA thankfully didn't have the mindset of trying to have certain commodities not grown, right? That certainly would not be good for our ag markets. It was really focused on what are the preventive practices that are realistic for farms in order to reduce risk and ultimately reduce the number of outbreaks that we have. Yeah.
So something like pumpkins and gourds, even though they're grown on the ground, they're not consumed raw.
Correct.
Is strawberries.
Right. Or cantaloupe or cucumbers.
Okay, thank you. So we went ahead and put some questions from your talk into a poll. So hopefully everybody can see that on the screen and can participate.
And hopefully I covered it all.
You did, and we still have some extra time here. So if anyone wants to ask some more questions in the chat, please do.
Oh, I just saw here with a second part to Ashley's question about the tester. So Ashley, is that a tester? You mean the lab that you're using only does the combined test? The lab, yeah. So the FDA has a fact sheet that lists out what they consider appropriate water tests to be used. If you just Googled FDA produce safety rule water tests, you would be able to find that. And I think that would be really helpful for you in terms of talking with the lab about the test that you want. The one that we most commonly see available here in New Jersey is the EPA 1603 method. And so if there's a positive E. coli response to that test, it'll give you a number value, which is way more information for you than if it's just a presence absence test. So.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to end the poll questions, and then Meredith, you can go over the poll with your group.
Okay. All right, name one of the 3 things needed for bacteria to multiply: appropriate temperature, moisture, food source, all of the above. Ding, ding, ding. You guys got it. Can you wash contaminants off of a food that has been contaminated? So interesting. So we've got 56% said yes and 44% said no. So you can try to wash them off. But it's really difficult, right? On the surfaces, these contaminants can hunker down, and it's like nearly impossible to get them all off of the surface. So that's why we really focus on preventing the contamination in the first place, rather than relying on washing after the fact. But we do see a lot of washing happen on farms, and a lot of times there's multiple purposes, right? So that washing is helping to cool down the produce after it's come out of the field, right? It might have field heat on it, needs to be cooled down before it goes into the cooler. We can certainly, make the produce look cleaner, getting any soil off of the surface. And there might be some pathogen reduction in that process. It really depends on a lot of factors. But we're not relying on that washing to remove contaminants rather than preventive practices. And then name one contamination source in the farm environment, right? Humans, animals, soil, water, buildings, equipment, and tools, all of the above. All right, you guys were paying attention.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Meredith.
You're welcome. Thank you all.